swept across the Wallachian plain in the June of 1462 did not smell of the coming summer harvest. It did not carry the scent of pine from the Carpathian Mountains or the fresh mud of the Danube riverbanks. Instead, it carried a scent that defied description, a cloying, heavy, metallic stench that clung to the back of the throat and made the eyes water. It was the smell of death, but not the clean, sudden death of the battlefield. It was the smell of slow, agonizing rot, amplified by the blistering heat of the sun and the buzzing of a million flies. Marching into this wind was the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. The Ottoman army, a colossal serpent of steel and silk, stretched for miles across the horizon. At its head rode the Janissaries, the elite shock troops of the empire, men who had been taken as boys and forged into perfect weapons of war. They were disciplined, fearless, and fanatically loyal. They had stormed the impregnable walls of Constantinople just 9 years prior. They had faced Hungarian heavy cavalry, Serbian knights, and Venetian navies without blinking. But today, under the pale light of the moon, these hardened warriors were covering their faces with cloth, retching into the dust, their eyes wide with a primal terror that no drill sergeant could beat out of them. At the center of this terrified host rode Sultan Mehmed II. He was known to the world as Fatih, the Conqueror. He was the man who had fulfilled the ancient prophecy, the man who had ended the Roman Empire, the Caesar of Rome, and the shadow of God on earth. He was a man of immense intellect and culture, a scholar who read Homer in the original Greek and studied the maps of Alexander the Great. He had seen battlefields littered with thousands of corpses. He was no stranger to violence. He had ordered executions and massacres in the name of statecraft. But as his horse crested the final hill overlooking the road to Targovishta, the capital of Wallachia, even the conqueror pulled his reins tight. The geography of the world seemed to have warped. The road ahead was gone. In its place stood a forest. But it was a forest that grew from hell, not from the earth. Stretching out for nearly 2 miles, covering an area of nearly 7 acres, was a grove of 20,000 wooden stakes. And upon each stake was a human body. The scene was a masterpiece of macabre engineering. The stakes were arranged in concentric circles and geometric patterns, creating a labyrinth of agony. There were Ottoman soldiers, captured during the winter raids, still wearing fragments of their uniforms. There were local nobles, treacherous boyars who had betrayed their prince. There were women, their long hair matted with blood, and there were children, pinned like insects to the wood. The cruelty was democratic. It spared no age, no gender, and no rank. Mehmed rode slowly into the shade of this forest of the dead. The silence was deafening, broken only by the flapping of carrion birds, crows, ravens, and vultures that had grown so fat on human flesh they could barely fly. They sat atop the heads of the corpses, watching the living emperor pass with indifferent eyes. Mehmet noticed the precision of the carnage. The stakes were not merely sharpened sticks, they were smooth, oiled, and rounded at the tip. They had been driven into the victims with surgical care to avoid piercing the heart or the liver, ensuring that death would not come quickly. Some of these men had writhed in agony for days before succumbing. It was a tableau of suffering suspended in time. In the center of this horror, elevated on a stake taller than the rest to signify his high station, hung the rotting corpse of Hamza Bey, the Sultan's own beloved general. He still wore his crimson robes of silk, now tattered and stained black. The sight of his friend and commander reduced to carrion meat struck Mehmed with the force of a physical blow. He stopped his horse. The Sultan, whose ambition was to conquer the world from east to west, looked around at the silent, accusing faces of 20,000 dead souls. According to the chroniclers who rode beside him, the Sultan sat in silence for a long time. The invincible conqueror was shaken to his core. He whispered to his Grand Vizier, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a strange, horrified awe. "How," he asked, "can we despoil the land of a man who does such things?" A man who can marshal his own people and his enemies in such a way. Such a man is worth more than a kingdom. It was a moment of terrifying clarity. Mehmed realized that he was not fighting a king or a general or a rebel. He was fighting a mirror image of the darkest parts of the human soul. He was fighting a monster that he himself had helped to create. For the man who planted this forest was not a stranger. He was Vlad III, the voivode of Wallachia. But Mehmed knew him by another name. He knew him as the boy he had grown up with in the gardens of the Topkapi Palace. He knew him as the intense, brooding hostage who had studied war at his side. This forest was not just a defensive fortification. It was a message. A personal letter written in blood and wood from Vlad to Mehmed. It said, "I know you. I know what scares you. And I am willing to go further than you ever will. To understand how a human being becomes capable of such an atrocity, we must rewind the clock. We must leave the rotting fields of 1462 and travel back 31 years to a cold stone fortress in the mountains of Transylvania. We must go back to the beginning, before the blood, before the stakes, to a time when the monster was just a child named Vlad. The year was 1431, and Europe was a continent holding its breath. The medieval world was dying, and the modern world was struggling to be born amidst fire and plague. To the east, the Islamic Ottoman Empire was rising like a tidal wave, consuming everything in its path. To the west, the fractured kingdoms of Christendom were bickering and divided. And caught directly in the middle, like a piece of meat between two grinding millstones, was the Principality of Wallachia. Wallachia was a cursed land by virtue of its geography. It was a flat, fertile plain that offered no natural defenses against invasion. It was the gateway to Europe for the Turks and the buffer zone for the Hungarians. To rule Wallachia was to sign a death warrant. The average reign of a Wallachian prince was less than 2 years. They were murdered by their own nobles, assassinated by Ottoman agents, or killed in battle by Hungarian kings. Into this cauldron of treachery, Vlad III was born. His father was Vlad II, a man of immense physical strength and questionable moral character. Vlad II had spent his youth as a mercenary and a diplomat, learning the hard lessons of survival. In 1431, he traveled to the city of Nuremberg to kneel before Sigismund of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor. There, in a candlelit cathedral, Vlad II was inducted into the Order of the Dragon. The Societas Draconistarum, or Order of the Dragon, was a chivalric military society modeled after the Order of St. George. Its members, kings, princes, and high nobility, swore a blood oath to defend the cross against the enemies of Christianity, specifically the Ottoman Turks. They wore medallions depicting a dragon curled into a circle with a cross on its back. The dragon represented the devil, or the enemies of faith, being strangled by the power of Christ. When Vlad II returned to Wallachia wearing this medallion, the peasants, who knew nothing of Latin or high politics, saw the dragon and gave him a new name. They called him Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon. But in the Romanian language, the word Dracul had a double meaning. It meant dragon, yes, but it also meant devil. His son, the second of 3 brothers, was baptized Vlad, but the people distinguished him by his father's name. He became Dracula, the son of the dragon, the son of the devil. It was a name that carried a heavy destiny, a prophecy woven into the very syllables. Vlad's childhood was not filled with toys or games. It was filled with the sound of sharpening steel and the hushed whispers of conspiracy. He grew up in the fortress city of Sigishwara and later in the princely court of Targovishte. His education was that of a knight. He learned to ride before he could read. He learned to wield a sword, a lance, and a bow. He was taught that mercy was a luxury a prince could not afford. He watched his father navigate the treacherous waters of Balkan politics, swearing loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan one day and the Hungarian king the next. He saw his father lie, cheat, and betray to keep his family alive. He learned that honor was a word for poems, but survival was the only truth in reality. But the defining trauma of his life, the event that would shatter his soul and reassemble it into something jagged and sharp, came in 1442. Vlad was 11 years old. His younger brother, Radu, was 7. Their father, Vlad Dracula, had fallen out of favor with the Ottomans. Sultan Murad II, the father of Mehmed the Conqueror, suspected Dracula of plotting with the Hungarians. He summoned the Wallachian prince to a diplomatic meeting. It was a trap. The moment Dracula and his sons crossed the Danube, they were seized by Ottoman soldiers. They were dragged in chains to Gallipoli, humiliated and terrified. Vlad Dracula was thrown into a dungeon. For months, he waited for death. But Sultan Murad had a different use for him. He needed a vassal in Wallachia, not a martyr. He offered Dracula a deal. You may return to your throne. You may rule Wallachia, but you will leave your sons with me. It was the oldest insurance policy in the ancient world. The sons would be hostages. If Dracula remained loyal, the boys would be treated as guests, educated and cared for. If Dracula betrayed the Sultan, the boys would die. And not just die, they would be tortured, blinded, or gelded. Vlad Dracula, faced with the choice between his crown and his children, chose his crown. He rode back to Wallachia, leaving his 2 young sons standing alone on the dusty plains of Anatolia, surrounded by soldiers speaking a language they did not understand. The fortress of Eriguz, high in the mountains of western Anatolia, became their prison and their school. For 6 years, Vlad and Radu lived in the belly of the beast, but it was a gilded cage. Sultan Murad did not throw them in a dungeon. He put them in the palace school. His plan was insidious. He did not want to kill the boys. He wanted to convert them. He wanted to raise them as Ottomans, so that one day he could send them back to Wallachia to rule as loyal puppets. They were tutored by the finest scholars in the Islamic world. They learned logic, the Quran, Turkish literature, and Persian poetry. They were trained in the arts of war by the Janissaries, the very men who would one day be their enemies. They learned how to ride like Turks, how to shoot arrows from horseback, and how to use the curved scimitar. But the 2 brothers reacted to this captivity in diametrically opposite ways. Radu, the 7-year-old, was soft, beautiful, and eager for affection. He looked around at the splendor of the Ottoman court, the silk tapestries, the exotic foods, the immense power, and he was seduced. He saw the Sultan not as a captor, but as a father figure. He embraced Islam. He adopted the Turkish dress and customs. He became known as Radu Cel Frumos, Radu the Handsome. He became the favorite companion of the Sultan's heir, the young Mehmed. They hunted together, studied together, and perhaps, as rumors suggested, became lovers. Radu was the perfect success story of the Ottoman hostage system, a prince who forgot his own name. Vlad was different. Vlad was iron. He was 11, old enough to remember who he was, and old enough to hate. He refused to break. He refused to speak Turkish unless forced. He mocked his teachers. He spat at the guards. He developed a reputation for a volatile, violent temper. And for his defiance, he was punished. The chronicles are vague on the details, but we can infer the horror. A defiant hostage in a medieval prison would not be treated gently. Vlad was likely beaten, starved, and thrown into solitary confinement. But the true torture was psychological. He lived every day with a knife at his throat. Every time a messenger arrived from Wallachia, Vlad knew it could be his death warrant. If his father made one wrong move, Vlad would be executed. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, a predator constantly scanning for threats. It was during these long, dark years that Vlad began to study his captors with a terrifying intensity. He stopped fighting them physically and started dissecting them mentally. He observed how the Sultan ruled over such a vast, multi-ethnic empire. He saw that the Ottomans did not rule through love. They ruled through fear. Absolute, unwavering fear. He watched the public executions. He saw thieves having their hands cut off. He saw traitors being skinned alive. And he saw the stake. Impalement was not invented by Vlad. It was an ancient punishment used by empires from Assyria to Rome. But the Ottomans used it effectively to terrorize populations. Vlad watched, and he learned. He realized that fear was a tool, a lever that could move mountains. He realized that morality was a weakness that a ruler could not afford. To survive in a world of wolves, one had to become a dragon. He also watched the young Mehmed. They were close in age, studying in the same halls. They knew each other. They assessed each other. Mehmed was the Golden Prince, destined to rule the world. Vlad was the prisoner, the barbarian from the north. A rivalry began to fester between them, a dark mirror of ambition. Mehmed wanted to conquer the world. Vlad just wanted to burn it down to protect what was his. In 1447, the axe finally fell. But it didn't fall on Vlad. It fell on his father. News reached the Ottoman court that the Hungarian warlord John Hunyadi had invaded Wallachia. The boyars of Targovishte, sensing a shift in the wind, had betrayed Vlad Dracula. They didn't just kill him. That would have been too kind. They captured him in the marshes of Bauteni. They buried him alive. And then came the news that broke whatever humanity was left in the teenage Vlad. His older brother, Mircea, the one he had looked up to, the heir to the throne, had been captured by the merchants of Targovishte. They had tortured him. They had taken red-hot iron pokers and burned his eyes out of his skull. Then, while he was blind and screaming in agony, they buried him alive alongside his father. Vlad received this news in the silence of his Ottoman captivity. He did not weep. He did not scream. Something inside him simply turned off. The boy who had been fighting to hold on to his identity died. In his place, the dragon was born. He realized that there was no justice in the world. God was silent. His father, a member of the Order of the Dragon, had been murdered by Christians. His brother had been tortured by his own people. The only truth was power. The only way to ensure safety was to be more terrifying than the enemy. The Sultan, Murad II, saw an opportunity. Wallachia was now in chaos. He called for Vlad. He told the 17-year-old boy that he was going home. He gave him a uniform, a sword, and a detachment of Ottoman cavalry. "Go," the Sultan said. "Take your father's throne, and remember who gave it to you." In 1448, Vlad Dracula rode back into Wallachia. But he did not ride as a Christian knight. He rode at the head of a Muslim army, wearing Turkish armor, speaking Turkish words. He was a puppet prince, installed by the very men who held him captive. The people of Wallachia looked at him with suspicion. The boyars looked at him with contempt. Vlad took the throne, but he knew it was a farce. He was surrounded by enemies. The Hungarians were coming to kill him. The Ottomans expected him to be a slave. The nobles who had buried his brother alive were bowing to his face and sharpening their knives behind his back. His first reign lasted only 2 months. The Hungarian army returned, and Vlad, too weak to fight them, was forced to flee. He escaped into the forests of Moldavia, a fugitive once again. The first chapter of his life had ended in failure, but the lessons had been learned. He had seen the face of the enemy, and he had seen the treachery of his friends. He spent the next 8 years wandering the wilds of Eastern Europe, a prince without a crown, honing his rage, sharpening his mind, and waiting for the moment when the world would burn, and he would be the one holding the torch. The cage had done its work. The wolf was loose, and soon the world would know his name. The year 1453 shattered the spine of the medieval world. On a Tuesday in May, the impossible happened. The great walls of Constantinople, which had stood for 1,000 years as the shield of Christendom, crumbled under the bombardment of Ottoman cannons. Mehmed II, the young sultan whom the Christian courts had dismissed as an inexperienced boy, rode his white horse into the Hagia Sophia and declared it a mosque. The Roman Empire was dead. A shadow had fallen across Europe, and the kings of the West woke up to a terrifying reality. There was nothing stopping the Ottoman war machine from marching all the way to Rome. In this atmosphere of apocalyptic dread, the calculus of power shifted. The Kingdom of Hungary, the last line of defense, was in a panic. John Hunyadi, the great Hungarian warlord who had spent his life fighting the Turks, realized he needed a new strategy. He needed a buffer zone. He needed Wallachia to be a wall of iron, not a revolving door of weak princes. He looked at the current ruler of Wallachia, Vladislav II, and saw a man who was wavering, a man who was bending the knee to the Sultan. Hunyadi realized he had made a mistake years ago by exiling Vlad Dracula. He realized that to fight a monster like Mehmed, he didn't need a diplomat. He needed a wolf. And so, the exile ended. Vlad Dracula, now a hardened man of 25, was given an army. He was unleashed. In the summer of 1456, while Halley's Comet burned across the sky, a celestial omen that terrifyingly predicted war and plague, Vlad crossed the Carpathians. He met his rival, Vladislav II, in battle. The chronicles are sparse, but legend says Vlad didn't just command from the rear. He hunted his enemy down. Vladislav was killed in hand-to-hand combat, decapitated by the man he had underestimated. Vlad III ascended the throne of Wallachia for the second time. But he was not the same terrified boy who had worn the crown 8 years earlier. The years of exile, of hunger, of watching the machinery of empires turn had stripped him of all illusions. He stood on the balcony of the princely palace in Targovista and looked down at his subjects. He saw the faces of the boyars, the wealthy landed nobility. These were the men in silk robes who smiled and bowed. These were the men who controlled the army, the taxes, and the courts. And Vlad knew, with the certainty of a predator, that these were the men who had murdered his father. He understood the fundamental flaw of his country. Wallachia was weak not because of the Ottomans, but because of the boyars. They were parasites. For decades, they had treated the throne like a musical chair. If a prince demanded too much, they assassinated him. If a prince fought the Turks, they betrayed him to save their lands. They had created a system of anarchy where they held the real power. Vlad realized that before he could ever hope to fight the Dragon of the East, he had to slay the Hydra at home. He had to break the wheel of treason, and he would not do it with laws or decrees. He would do it with a hammer. The winter of 1456 passed in a tense silence. Vlad played the part of the dutiful ruler. He confirmed the boyars' privileges. He signed their documents. He lulled them into a sense of security. They thought they had another puppet, a fierce one perhaps, but one they could manage. They were fatally wrong. Easter Sunday, April 1457, the holiest day in the Christian calendar. The bells of Targoviste were ringing, calling the faithful to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. Vlad issued a summons. He invited all the major noble families of Wallachia, the princes, the landowners, the generals, along with their wives and eldest sons, to a great feast at the palace. It was to be a celebration of peace and unity. They came in their hundreds. They arrived in carriages gilded with gold, wearing furs imported from Russia and silks from the Orient. They swept into the great hall, arrogant and loud, jostling for position near the head of the table. They drank the prince's wine and ate his roasted boar. They laughed and toasted to his long reign, the lies dripping from their lips like grease. Vlad sat at the head of the high table watching them. He did not eat. He did not drink. He simply watched. He saw the face of the man who had whispered in his father's ear before the betrayal. He saw the woman whose husband had organized the ambush. He saw the sons of the men who had held the red-hot pokers to his brother's eyes. The rage that had been simmering in his gut for 10 years began to boil over. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the hall, Vlad raised his hand. The music stopped. The doors to the hall were slammed shut and barred from the outside. The laughter died in the nobles' throats. Vlad stood up. His voice, described by chroniclers as low and chilling, cut through the silence. He asked a simple question to the assembled guests. "How many princes have you ruled under?" The boyars, confused, began to answer. They thought it was a game. They thought the prince wanted to admire their longevity. "I have served 7 voivodes," one old lord boasted. "I have served 12, bragged another. "I have seen 20 princes rise and fall," claimed a third. They were bragging about their treason. They were admitting that no prince survived more than a year or two under their watch. They were boasting that they were the true rulers of Wallachia. Vlad smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You have not served them," he said. "You have murdered them." At his signal, the walls of the room seemed to come alive. Soldiers who had been hiding behind the tapestries stepped forward with drawn swords. The feast turned into an abattoir. The screaming began. For the older boyars, the heads of the families, the ones directly responsible for the years of anarchy, there was no mercy. They were dragged out into the courtyard of the palace. There, under the light of torches, Vlad's executioners were waiting with the stakes. They were impaled one by one, their bodies hoisted into the air to form a groaning, dying garden around the palace walls. It was the first forest of the dead, a miniature rehearsal for what was to come. But for the younger nobles, the strong men and their wives, Vlad had a punishment that was arguably worse than death. He did not kill them. He enslaved them. He stripped them of their fine clothes, their jewelry, and their dignity. He chained them together like common criminals. Then, he marched them north. They walked for 50 miles, barefoot, over jagged rocks and through thorny forests, whipped by Vlad's guards whenever they slowed down. Their destination was the Argesh River, at the foot of a sheer, terrifying cliff. High above, piercing the clouds, stood the ruins of an ancient fortress, an eagle's nest that was deemed impossible to build upon. "Build me a castle," Vlad ordered. These were men who had never lifted anything heavier than a goblet of wine. These were women whose hands had only known silk. Now, they were forced to form a human chain up the side of the mountain. They carried heavy limestone blocks on their backs, crawling up goat paths. They mixed mortar with their bare hands. They worked day and night under the lash of the whip. Months passed. Their clothes rotted off their bodies, leaving them naked and exposed to the elements. They died of exhaustion, of heart failure, of starvation. When a noble dropped dead, his body was simply tossed into the ravine below, and the person behind him was forced to pick up his stone. By the time Ponari Castle was finished, the old nobility of Wallachia had ceased to exist. Their bones were in the mortar. Their blood was in the foundation. Vlad had done the impossible. He had decapitated the entire ruling class in a single stroke. In their place, he promoted his own men, peasants, mercenaries, and minor soldiers who had shown loyalty. He created a new meritocracy based on blood and iron. These new nobles owed everything to Vlad. They would not betray him, because without him, they were nothing. With absolute power secured, Vlad turned his attention to the country itself. He looked at Wallachia and saw a land of crime, laziness, and poverty. He decided to fix it the only way he knew how, with terror. He rewrote the laws. Theft was punishable by death. Lying was punishable by death. Adultery was punishable by death. And the method of execution was almost always the stake. It did not matter if you were a wealthy merchant who cheated on his taxes or a starving peasant who stole a loaf of bread. The punishment was the same. The psychological impact of this regime was profound. Fear became the air that Wallachia breathed. But with fear came order. For the first time in living memory, the roads were safe. You could walk from one end of the principality to the other with a bag of gold on your shoulder, and no one would dare touch you. The bandits disappeared. The thieves vanished. Legend tells of a golden cup that Vlad placed by a public well in the central square of Targovishte. It was made of solid gold, encrusted with gems, a king's ransom sitting in the open. He decreed that anyone could use the cup to drink the cool water, but the cup must never leave the well. In any other city in Europe, London, Paris, Rome, that cup would have been stolen in 5 minutes. In Targovishte, it remained there for his entire reign. Thousands of thirsty peasants, travelers, and merchants drank from it. They held a fortune in their hands, wiped their mouths, and set it back down. They did not steal it because of morality. They did not steal it because of God. They left it there because they knew that the dragon was watching, and that the price of that gold was a wooden stake through the gut. Vlad had created a utopia of honesty, but it was a utopia built in hell. But a dragon needs to eat, and Vlad's ambition was consuming the region. His strict economic policies brought him into conflict with the Saxon merchants of Transylvania. These German-speaking traders had grown rich by exploiting Wallachia's weakness, avoiding taxes, and supporting Vlad's rivals. Vlad decided to teach them a lesson. He launched raids into Transylvania, burning the Saxon villages of Kronstadt and Hermannstadt. It was here that his reputation as a monster began to spread to the west. He didn't just kill the men. He impaled entire villages. He supposedly dined among the forest of corpses, dipping his bread in the blood of his victims. These stories were likely exaggerated by the terrified survivors and later printed in pamphlets, the horror tabloids of the 15th century, thanks to the newly invented printing press. Vlad was becoming the first media villain in history. The Germans printed woodcuts of him butchering monks and boiling children. They called him a devil. Vlad didn't care. Let them hate him, as long as they feared him. He was securing his borders. He was fortifying his castles. He was stockpiling weapons. Because he knew the real war was coming. By 1459, 3 years into his reign, the Ottoman envoys arrived again. They noticed the change. The tribute payments from Wallachia had stopped. The boys for the Janissary Corps were not being sent. The buffer zone was acting like a sovereign state. Sultan Mehmed II, busy with campaigns in Greece and Trebizond, sent a warning. He sent messengers to remind the Wallachian prince of his place. "Pay the jizya," the Sultan commanded. "Bend the knee." Vlad received the messengers in his throne room. He looked at the turbaned envoys, and through them, he saw the face of the boy he had grown up with. He saw Mehmed. He saw the cage he had lived in for 6 years. And he realized he was done kneeling. He looked at his treasury, filled with the confiscated wealth of the dead boyars. He looked at his army, led by men who worshipped him. He looked at the fortress of Ponari, standing invincible in the mountains. The dragon was ready to breathe fire. He sent the envoys back with a refusal, but he didn't just refuse the money. He refused the submission. He stopped the tribute entirely. In Istanbul, Mehmed II frowned. He had tolerated this insolent prince for too long. He decided it was time to replace Vlad with someone more malleable. Perhaps Vlad's younger brother Radu, who was still living in the Sultan's palace, would make a better ruler. Mehmed prepared a small force, not an invasion army, but a policing action. 1,000 cavalry led by Hamza Bey, the trusted general, to arrest Vlad and bring him to Constantinople in chains. They thought it would be easy. They thought they were dealing with a petty criminal. They had no idea that they were walking into the mouth of a monster. The dragon had tasted blood, and now he was hungry for war. The winter of 1461 was one of the coldest in living memory. The Danube River, the massive, winding artery that separated the Christian north from the Muslim south, had frozen solid. It was no longer a river. It was a highway of ice, gray and jagged, stretching into the mist. To the Ottoman garrison stationed along the southern bank, the ice was a nuisance, forcing them to huddle around braziers in their stone fortresses, waiting for the spring thaw to resume their trade and patrols. They believed the war season was over. Armies did not march in winter. Horses could not find forage in the snow. The world was asleep. They were wrong. For Vlad Dracula, the ice was not a barrier, it was a bridge. But before the ice turned red, there was the matter of Hamza Bey. As the year 1461 waned, Sultan Mehmed II had decided to deal with his insolent vassal quietly. He did not want a costly war. He wanted a decapitation strike. He dispatched Hamza Bey, the governor of Nicopolis and one of his most trusted commanders, with a force of 1,000 elite cavalry. Their orders were specific. Lure Vlad out of his fortress under the pretense of a diplomatic meeting at Giurgiu, a port city on the Danube. Once Vlad stepped out into the open, they were to seize him, bind him in chains, and drag him to Constantinople. It was a classic Ottoman trap. one that had worked on dozens of Balkan princes before. But Hamza Bey made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed he was hunting a bear, a strong but simple beast. He did not realize he was hunting a wolf who could smell a trap from miles away. Vlad received the invitation to meet at Giurgiu. He accepted, but he did not come alone, and he did not come unprepared. He rode south with his own personal guard, a detachment of heavy cavalry deeply loyal and heavily armored. As they approached the meeting point, a narrow pass near the frozen river, Hamza Bey sprang his trap. The Ottoman cavalry emerged from the tree line surrounding the Wallachian prince. In that moment, Hamza Bey must have smiled. The game was over. The dragon was caught. But the smile died on his lips when he heard the sound of horns echoing from the ridges above. Vlad had not just brought a guard. He had moved his entire army in secret, marching them through the forests by night. The trappers were now the trapped. Vlad's forces descended like an avalanche. The Ottoman cavalry, cramped in the narrow pass and outnumbered, were slaughtered. Hamza Bey was captured alive. Vlad wanted him to witness what was coming. Vlad took the Ottoman general and the surviving captives back to Targovishta. There, on the outskirts of the city, he prepared a special display. He ordered the longest, thickest steak to be carved and oiled. He did not want Hamza Bey to die on the ground like a common soldier. He raised him high into the air, impaling him in his silk robes, ensuring that even in death, his rank was respected. Around him, the 1,000 soldiers of the arrest party were impaled in a circle. It was a forest of agony, a grotesque warning that faced south. But Vlad was not finished. He knew that killing Hamza Bey was an act of war. There was no going back. The Sultan would come with the full might of the empire in the spring. Vlad had a choice. He could retreat to his mountains and wait for the siege, or he could do the unthinkable. He could attack. He chose the offensive. In February 1462, while the Danube was still a sheet of ice, Vlad Dracula unleashed the Night Raid campaign. It was one of the most brutal and effective guerrilla operations in military history. Vlad utilized his greatest weapon, his identity. He spoke Turkish like a native. He knew the passwords, the customs, and the uniforms of the Ottoman army. He dressed himself and his elite vanguard in the armor stripped from Hamza Bey's dead soldiers. Under the cover of darkness and snow, they crossed the frozen Danube. They approached the fortress of Giurgiu. The Ottoman sentries on the walls saw a column of Turkish cavalry returning from a patrol. They saw the turbans, the scimitars, and heard the commander shouting orders in perfect Turkish. They opened the gates. Vlad rode into the courtyard of the fortress. He waited until the portcullis slammed shut behind him. Then, he drew his sword. "I am the dragon," he roared. The massacre was total. The fortress of Giurgiu fell in an hour. Vlad set the city on fire, the flames reflecting off the ice of the river. But he didn't stop there. He rode west, then east, moving like a phantom along the southern bank of the Danube, inside Ottoman territory. He hit Rus. He hit Tutrakan. He hit Nicopolis. Fortress after fortress fell to the same ruse, or to the sheer ferocity of the surprise attack. Vlad was not just capturing territory, he was creating a dead zone. He burned the crops in the granaries. He slaughtered the livestock. He killed the peasants in the fields. His goal was ruthless logistics. When Mehmed's massive army arrived in the spring, they would find nothing to eat, nowhere to sleep, and no one to guide them. This campaign was not a frenzy of mindless violence. It was a bureaucratic extermination. We know this because Vlad counted. After the campaign, exhausted and covered in soot, Vlad sat down in his tent and wrote a letter to his ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. He needed to prove to the Christian king that he was doing God's work. He needed to prove that the money Matthias had received from the Pope for a crusade was being well spent. The letter, dated February 11, 1462, is one of the most chilling documents in human history. It reads like a receipt from a butcher shop. I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young, who lived at Obluchica and Novoselo, where the Danube flows into the sea. We killed 23,884 Turks, without counting those whom we burned in homes, or the Turks whose heads were cut by our soldiers. He broke it down by location, meticulous in his accounting. At Giurgiu, 6,414. At Enisala, 1,350. At Durostor, 6,840. At Orsova, 343. At Harshova, 840. At Marotin, 210. To accompany the letter, Vlad sent a caravan of sacks to the Hungarian court. When King Matthias opened them in front of his horrified courtiers, thousands of severed noses and ears tumbled out onto the floor. It was grotesque proof of the body count. Vlad wanted the world to know that the Ottoman Empire bled just like any other beast. Your Majesty, Vlad wrote, you must know that I have broken the peace with him. I have no desire to keep it. The news of the devastation traveled fast. It reached Constantinople before the spring thaw. Sultan Mehmed II was in his palace gardens when the messengers arrived. They told him of Hamza Bey's fate. They told him of the burning fortresses along the Danube. They told him that a vassal prince, a man who ruled a country smaller than some Ottoman provinces, had just invaded the empire and slaughtered nearly 25,000 subjects. The chroniclers say that Mehmed was so enraged that he struck the messenger. The insult was intolerable. It wasn't just the loss of life, it was the audacity. Vlad had humiliated the House of Osman. Mehmed realized that this was no longer a police action. This was a holy war. He ordered the tugs, the horsetail standards of war, to be raised in the palace courtyard. He sent riders to every corner of his vast empire. From the deserts of Anatolia to the mountains of the Balkans, the call went out. Gather. The Sultan was assembling a host to end all hosts. He called upon the Janissaries, the Sipahi cavalry, the Azap infantry, the Akinji raiders. He commissioned engineers to build pontoon bridges to cross the Danube. He dragged massive cannons from the armory, the same guns that had shattered the walls of Constantinople. Historians estimate the size of the army Mehmed gathered in the spring of 1462 at somewhere between 90,000 and 120,000 men. It was the second largest army to march in Europe in the 15th century. It was a force capable of crushing kingdoms, let alone a small principality like Wallachia. Against this tidal wave of steel, Vlad Dracula could muster perhaps 30,000 men. Most of them were not knights. They were peasants armed with axes, scythes, and rusted spears. They were outnumbered 3-1, perhaps 4-1. They had no heavy cavalry. They had no cannons. When the spies returned to Targovishta and told Vlad of the size of the Ottoman host, his generals advised him to flee. They told him to run to Hungary, to beg for asylum. They said fighting was suicide. Vlad looked at them with his pale, intense eyes. He knew they were right. Conventional war was suicide. If he met Mehmed on the open field, Wallachia would die in an afternoon. We will not fight them on the field, Vlad said. We will fight them in their minds. He ordered the evacuation of the southern villages. He ordered the poisoning of the wells. He ordered the burning of the crops. And then he sharpened his stakes. The dragon waited. The Sultan marched. And the stage was set for the most terrifying game of cat and mouse in the history of warfare. June 1462 arrived not with the promise of summer, but with the suffocating weight of an apocalypse. The Danube River, which had been a highway of ice just months before, was now a swollen, muddy torrent. Across this natural barrier, the Ottoman army began its crossing. It took days. The sheer scale of Mehmet II's force was staggering. Over 100,000 men, janissaries, sipahis, akinjis, engineers, and camp followers poured into Wallachia like a slow-moving oil slick. Their armor glinted in the sun, a river of steel flowing north. Their cannons, dragged by teams of oxen, groaned under their own weight, carving deep ruts into the mud. Sultan Mehmet II rode at the center of this host, confident in the logic of numbers. In the history of warfare, math usually won. He had 10 times the soldiers, 10 times the gold, and 100 times the cannons of his enemy. By all conventional metrics, the campaign should have been a short, brutal police action. He would march to Targovishta, crush the petty prince in a decisive battle, install Radu on the throne, and be back in Constantinople before the autumn rains. But as the Ottoman vanguard pushed deeper into Wallachia, the logic of numbers began to fail. They found themselves marching into a void. Vlad Dracula had enacted the policy of scorched earth with a terrifying thoroughness. The Ottoman scouts, riding ahead to forage for food and water, found nothing but ash. Every village within a day's march of the road had been burned to the ground. Every granary had been emptied or torched. Every livestock animal, cow, pig, chicken, had been slaughtered or driven north into the mountains. The land was dead. There was no wheat to bake bread. There was no meat to feed the soldiers. But worst of all, there was no water. Vlad's men had not just retreated. They had poisoned the wells. They threw carcasses of dead animals, rotting vegetation, and poisonous herbs into the water sources. The summer heat was blistering, temperatures soaring into the 90s. The Ottoman soldiers, marching in heavy chainmail and wool, began to suffer from dehydration and dysentery. The glorious march of the conquerors turned into a thirsty, dusty slog through a wasteland. And then, the psychological terror began. Vlad knew the terrain. It was his home. It was a land of dense, ancient forests, marshes, and narrow valleys. He used the geography as a weapon. His army, smaller and lighter, moved through the woods like ghosts. They did not form battle lines. They struck from the shadows. An Ottoman column would be marching through a wooded pass, and suddenly a hail of arrows would erupt from the tree line. Men would fall, screaming. By the time the janissaries formed ranks and charged into the woods, the enemy was gone, leaving only footprints and laughter. At night, the terror intensified. Vlad's men dug wolf pits, deep holes filled with sharpened stakes, and covered them with thin branches and leaves. Ottoman cavalry patrols would ride confidently down a path, only to have the ground swallow them whole. The screams of horses impaled in the dark shattered the nerves of the soldiers trying to sleep. They were fighting a phantom. They were fighting hunger. They were fighting thirst. The morale of the greatest army on earth began to fracture. They whispered around their campfires that this land was cursed, that the prince was not a man, but a strigoi, a demon who commanded the forests themselves. Mehmed, frustrated but undeterred, pressed on. He knew that Vlad could not run forever. Targovishta, the capital, lay ahead. Vlad would have to defend his city. He would have to stand and fight. Mehmed drove his army relentlessly toward the capital, determined to force the decisive battle that would end this nightmare. By mid-June, the Ottoman army reached the outskirts of Targovishta. They set up camp just south of the city, in a valley surrounded by hills. It was a massive city of tents, a sprawling metropolis of canvas and silk. The Sultan's tent, a magnificent pavilion of red and gold, stood at the center, guarded by the elite janissaries. Mehmed believed the end was near. He would siege the city in the morning. But Vlad had no intention of waiting for the morning. He knew he could not win a siege. His walls would crumble under the Ottoman cannons, just as Constantinople's had. He needed to cut the head off the snake. He needed to kill Mehmed. On the afternoon of June 16th, a Turkish soldier rode into the Ottoman camp. He wore the uniform of a Sipahi cavalryman. He walked through the lines, speaking perfect Turkish, joking with the guards, asking about the location of the Sultan's tent. He observed the layout of the defenses, the rotation of the sentries, and the position of the command post. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. He was just another soldier in an army of 100,000. That soldier was Vlad Dracula. It is one of the most legendary feats of espionage in history. The Prince of Wallachia, disguised as one of his enemies, walked into the lion's den, marked his target, and walked out. He returned to his men hiding in the nearby forest and laid out the plan. It was madness. It was suicide. But it was their only chance. "We strike tonight," Vlad told his captains. "We go for the Sultan. If he dies, the army breaks. If we fail, we die with honor." The night of June 17, 1462 was moonless. Heavy clouds obscured the stars, plunging the valley into absolute darkness. The Ottoman camp was asleep, save for the perimeter guards. Inside the tents, men were exhausted, praying for the morning sun. 3 hours after midnight, the gates of hell opened. Vlad attacked from multiple directions at once, but he did not attack with stealth. He attacked with noise. Thousands of Wallachian soldiers lit torches simultaneously. They blew bugles, beat drums, and screamed war cries. They rushed the camp not to occupy ground, but to create chaos. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The sleeping Ottoman soldiers woke to a world of fire and noise. In the confusion, panic took hold. They grabbed their swords and rushed out of their tents. Seeing figures running in the dark, they attacked. Friendly fire tore the Ottoman army apart. Janissaries fought Sipahis. Anatolians fought Rumelians. In the dark, everyone looked like the Impaler. The Wallachia cavalry, led by Vlad, cut through the confusion like a knife. They rode hard, smashing through the outer rings of the camp, heading straight for the center. Straight for the red and gold pavilion. Vlad was a demon possessed. He hacked left and right, his eyes fixed on the prize. He wasn't trying to rout the army. He was trying to assassinate the emperor. The Wallachian wedge drove deeper and deeper, trampling tents and men alike. They reached the center. Vlad saw the magnificent tent. He roared a command, and his guard charged it. They slashed the ropes, collapsing the heavy silk. They stabbed their lances into the fabric, piercing the bodies inside. But fate, it seemed, was on the side of the Sultan. In the darkness and the chaos of the sprawling camp, Vlad had miscalculated. The tent he attacked belonged to the Grand Vizier, Mahmud Pasha, or perhaps another high-ranking official. The Sultan's tent was a few hundred yards away, surrounded by a wall of janissaries who had stood their ground, forming an impenetrable circle of shields and halberds around their master. Realizing the mistake and seeing the Ottoman resistance stiffening as the shock wore off, Vlad knew he had seconds to act before he was surrounded and crushed. The sun would be rising soon. "Retreat!" he ordered. As quickly as they had appeared, the Wallachians melted back into the night. They vanished into the forests, leaving behind a camp that was burning, bleeding, and screaming. When the sun rose on the morning of June 18th, the scale of the carnage was revealed. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead. Many had been killed by the Wallachians, but countless others had been killed by their own comrades in the panic. The camp was wrecked. The supplies were destroyed. Sultan Mehmed II emerged from his tent. He was alive, but he was pale. He looked at the devastation around him. He looked at the faces of his invincible janissaries and saw something he had never seen before. Fear. True, shaking fear. They had been attacked in their beds by a man who walked through walls. They had killed each other in the dark. They were outnumbered 10 to 1, yet they felt besieged. The night attack at Targovishta was a tactical failure. Mehmed was alive, but it was a strategic masterpiece. It had broken the psychological spine of the invasion. The Ottoman generals advised retreat. They said the land was cursed. They said the prince was in league with Shaitan. But Mehmed was stubborn. He was the conqueror. He would not be chased away by a night raid. He ordered the army to regroup. He ordered the march to continue. Targovishta was just a few miles away. He would take the capital. He would burn it to the ground. He would find Vlad and flay him alive. He pushed his terrified army forward. The gates of Targovishta loomed ahead. They were open. There were no archers on the walls. There were no soldiers manning the battlements. The city was silent. Mehmed rode toward the open gates, expecting a trap, expecting an ambush. But what he found was something far worse than an ambush. As he rounded the final bend in the road, the smell hit him first. And then, the sight. The dragon had one final card to play. He had prepared a welcome gift for the emperor. The sun rose over Targovishte on June 18, 1462, illuminating a scene that would scar the collective memory of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who had declared himself the heir to Caesar, sat atop his white stallion and stared into the abyss. He had expected a siege. He had expected walls manned by archers, gates barred with iron, and the desperate resistance of a trapped rat. Instead, the gates of the capital stood wide open. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it a stench so thick, so cloying, that seasoned veterans, men who had waded through the blood of Byzantium, fell to their knees and retched. Stretching out before the city, covering an area of nearly 7 acres, was Vlad's final masterpiece, the Forest of the Dead. 20,000 stakes, 20,000 human bodies. They were arranged in a vast, macabre amphitheater. It was a demographic cross-section of the war itself. There were Ottoman soldiers captured during the winter campaign, their uniforms tattered but recognizable. There were Bulgarian peasants who had refused to evacuate. There were Wallachian nobles, boyars who had shown a flicker of disloyalty, rotting alongside their wives and children. Even infants were not spared, pinned to the chests of their mothers in a grotesque parody of an embrace. The sheer engineering required to create this display was terrifying. To cut 20,000 stakes, to sharpen them, to grease them, and to mount 20,000 living human beings upon them without killing them instantly, required a logistical effort equal to building a cathedral. It was an act of industrial-scale cruelty. In the center of this forest, elevated on a stake higher than all the others, hung the decomposing body of Hamza Bey, the Sultan's childhood friend. The general sent to arrest Vlad months earlier was still wearing his red silk robes, now turned black by decay and dried blood. He looked down at his emperor with empty sockets, a silent sentinel in a city of ghosts. Mehmed II rode into the shade of the corpses. The buzzing of the flies was louder than the drums of war. The Sultan, a man of iron will, felt his resolve crumble. This was not war. This was madness. He realized with a chilling clarity that he could burn Targovishta to the ground. He could hunt Vlad to the ends of the earth, but he could never truly defeat a man who was willing to turn his own kingdom into a graveyard just to prove a point. According to the Greek historian Laonikos Chakokondiles, the Sultan turned his horse around. His face was pale. He whispered to his generals, "I cannot take the land of a man who does such things. A man who can marshal his people and his enemies in such a way is capable of anything." It was the only time in history that the Ottoman war machine was stopped, not by a wall of stone, but by a wall of fear. Mehmed ordered the retreat. The greatest army in the world turned its back on Wallachia and marched south, chased not by soldiers, but by nightmares. Vlad Dracula had won. Against all odds, against the mathematics of war, he had repelled the superpower of his age. He stood on the walls of Poinari Castle and watched the dust of the Ottoman army settle on the horizon. He was the savior of Europe, the dragon slayer. But Mehmed II was a genius strategist. He realized he could not defeat Vlad with swords, so he decided to defeat him with a mirror. He left Wallachia, but he left something behind. He left Radu. Radu the Handsome, Vlad's younger brother, the boy who had stayed in the cage and learned to love it. Radu did not come with an army of pillagers. He came with chests of gold and promises of peace. He rode through the devastated countryside, stopping at the villages that Vlad had burned, speaking to the boyars who were terrified of the next purge. He offered them a simple choice. "My brother is a monster," Radu told them. "He brings you only fire and stakes. He starves your children to fight a war he cannot win. I bring you the friendship of the Sultan. I bring you lower taxes. I bring you peace. Who would you rather serve? The dragon who drinks your blood, or the prince who brings you gold?" It was a seductive whisper. The people of Wallachia were exhausted. They had lived in terror for years. They were tired of the scorched earth. They were tired of looking at the stakes. One by one, the boyars defected, then the generals, then the common soldiers. Vlad watched his power evaporate like water in the desert. He was a brilliant commander, but he had forgotten the most important lesson of leadership. You cannot rule by fear alone forever. Eventually, the fear of the tyrant is outweighed by the exhaustion of the soul. By the autumn of 1462, Vlad was a fugitive in his own country. His army had deserted to Radu. He was hunted by his own brother. He retreated to his impregnable fortress at Poinari, high in the Carpathian Mountains. But even there he was not safe. Radu's forces, backed by Ottoman janissaries, laid siege to the castle. Legend tells us that during this siege, Vlad's wife stood on the battlements. She looked down at the river far below, and then looked at the approaching Turkish army. She knew the fate that awaited a captured princess in the Sultan's harem. "I would rather be food for the fish of the Argus than a slave to the Turks," she cried, and flung herself from the tower. Her body was broken on the rocks below, dyeing the water red. The river is called Raoul Douamne, the Ladies' River, to this day. Vlad, however, was not ready to die. In a final act of legendary daring, he escaped the siege. Folklore says he had his horses shod backward to confuse the trackers. He slipped through the Ottoman lines in the dead of night, fleeing north through the mountain passes, heading toward Hungary. He was going to his ally, King Matthias Corvinus. He expected a hero's welcome. He expected reinforcements to retake his throne. But politics is a cold business. King Matthias did not want another war with the Ottomans. He had already embezzled the crusade funds sent by the Pope to build his own palaces. He needed a scapegoat. He needed a reason to explain why he wasn't fighting the Turks. When Vlad arrived, Matthias arrested him. He produced forged letters, clumsy fakes, likely written by the vengeful Wallachian boyars, claiming that Vlad was plotting to ally with the Sultan to invade Hungary. It was a lie, but it served the king's purpose. The dragon was chained. The savior of Christendom was thrown into a dungeon in the Visegrad citadel. He would sit there, rotting in the darkness, for 12 years. Time passed. In Wallachia, Radu ruled as a loyal Ottoman vassal until he died of syphilis in 1475. With Radu gone, the region plunged back into chaos. The Ottoman threat to Hungary grew once more. King Matthias finally realized his mistake. He needed a watchdog. He needed a monster to guard the gate. In 1476, the dungeon doors opened. Vlad Dracula emerged. He was 45 years old. His hair was gray, his skin pale from a decade of darkness, but his eyes still burned with the same cold fire. He was unleashed for a third and final time. He marched back into Wallachia with a Hungarian army. He reclaimed his throne, executing the puppet princes who had taken his place. For a brief moment, the dragon sat on the throne again. But the world had moved on. The people did not cheer him. They feared him. They remembered the stakes. His third reign lasted barely 2 months. The Ottomans, sensing the return of their old nightmare, launched a massive counterattack. Vlad marched out to meet them near Bucharest. But this time, he was alone. The Hungarians had retreated. The Moldavians had gone home. And on the field of battle, as the Ottoman cavalry charged, the Wallachian nobles, the men he had once spared, turned their backs on him. The details of his death are shrouded in the fog of history. Some say he was surrounded by janissaries and fought like a demon, cutting down 10 men before he fell. Others say he was assassinated by one of his own soldiers, stabbed in the back while he looked at the horizon. But the end was final. The Ottomans took no chances. They cut off his head. They preserved it in a jar of honey to stop the rot and carried it all the way to Constantinople. There, in the city he had terrorized, the head of Vlad Dracula was displayed on a high stake. The Impaler was finally impaled. The Sultan Mehmed II could finally sleep. His body was reportedly buried by monks at the Snagov Monastery on a lonely island in the middle of a lake.
But centuries later, when archaeologists opened the tomb, they found it empty. Only the bones of a horse and a few fragments of rich cloth remained. The dragon had vanished into the mist, leaving behind only a name. The man died, but the ghost refused to rest. For centuries, the name Dracula was whispered in the villages of Romania as a strict but just father, a Tepesh who protected his children from the wolves. But in the West, thanks to the German printing press, he became a caricature of evil, a devil who dipped his bread in blood. 400 years later, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker found a book in a library. He saw the name Dracula. He read the footnote. In the Wallachian language, Dracula means devil. He took the name. He took the cruelty. He took the blood. And he created a vampire. Today, the true story of Vlad III is buried beneath the layers of fiction. We see the cape, the fangs, and the bats.
We forget the tragedy. We forget the boy who was tortured in a cage. We forget the prince who was betrayed by everyone he ever trusted. We forget the desperate general who burned his own country to save it. Vlad Dracula was a monster. There is no denying the blood on his hands. But he was a monster created by a monstrous world. He was a mirror reflecting the brutality of empires. He showed us that sometimes the line between the hero who saves his people and the villain who slaughters them is as thin as a wooden stake. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The Kingdom of Hungary is gone. The boyars are dust. But the name Dracula lives on. It is immortal. And perhaps, in the end, that is the only victory that matters. The dragon sleeps, but he never truly dies.